Now, so hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Central Eurasian Studies Summer Institute's first lecture of our 2022 lecture series. Though our lecture series will largely take place in person at UW-Madison this summer, we are lucky to have our guest speaker, Dr. Juldyz Smagulova, join us today from Kazakhstan. We ask that you please keep your cameras, if your microphone's muted, it can help to have your cameras turned off during the presentation. Hold any questions until the Q&A portion of this event after the presentation has ended. As you know, today's lecture is being recorded, though the Q&A portion will be edited out of any published recordings. So without further ado, let me introduce today's speaker. Dr. Smagulova is an associate professor and dean of College of Humanities and Education at KIMEP University. Her research interests include language ideology, language education, and language policy. She co-edited Language Change in Central Asia and co-authored the bilingual Kazakh-Russian Dictionary of Sociolinguistics. She has articles published in the Journal of Sociolinguistics, International Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism, International Journal of the Sociology of Language, World Englishes, and the International Journal of Bilingualism. Welcome, Dr. Smagulova.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. Thank you so very much. And let me start by thanking for inviting me. It's always a great pleasure to talk to my colleagues. So let me share my screen. And slideshow. Can you see it? Yeah.
Yes, we can see it.
Mm-hmm. And if you don't mind, I will leave because I'm working on the Mac, I will leave the bar with next slide so I know what's coming up. Okay. So as you already said, today I'm going to talk about my very short essay-like piece, which was published a couple of years ago in the Journal of Sociology of Language. And it's called When Language Policy is Not Enough. And this is where I'm trying to, try to think what is happening and why that language reform that has been largely successful in Kazakhstan still managed to create tension and social unrest. So what is we are doing, if not necessarily wrong, but what we need to critically think about and what do we need to change in the way we proceed with our language policy. Okay. And I'll start with a bit of background. I'm sure most people who are in the room are familiar with our context. Nevertheless, let me recap some of the information. So as many of you know, since 1991 and a little bit previously before that, Kazakhstan has been actively in the process of nation building. So we became an independent country from this after the Soviet Union disintegrated. And a lot of policy activities, including in language, including education, were aimed at helping discursively construct a new idea of the national state of Kazakhstan. And as you know from the literature and from the analysis of our documents, you know that the basic idea behind the nation state is very, very traditional. So we're building a very nationalistic state where the framing idea is that there is one territory, one language, and one people who speak the language. Okay, so Kazakhstan basically is a land of Kazakhs who speak Kazakh. Okay, so, and from the Soviet tradition, we have so-called titular nationality, who are the Kazakhs after whom this state is called, and they are the unifying and the central ethnicity around whom the whole ethnic identities built around. Okay, so that's nation building. So when we come to discursive construction of this nation state, a lot of it's done in terms of language planning. So of course there is a historiography, there is an archaeology, there is a political side to it, and many other things, but also the huge part of this discursive construction of new social reality is given to language planners. And our language planners basically played by the book. So we had the status planning, corpus planning, language spread, and identity planning. So the very first thing when the government did, when Kazakhstan became independent, they declared Kazakh the a state language. And Russian was given doesn't have an, even though it's kind of an official status in our constitution, it actually says Russian can be used apart of Kazakh if necessary. And the most recent regulation when it comes to a signage in linguistic landscape, the signage, official signage outside, now it says that Kazakh is an obligatory language and Russian can be used. So no signage is no longer required to be bilingual. Kazakh can be used if there is a necessity in that. Okay. And also if you check our literature, you will see the whole debate on what do we mean by national language, what do we mean by official language, and what do we mean by national language. So in Kazakhstan, when the Soviet Union collapsed, you also know about that. The Kazakhstan was and remains a multinational state, but ethnic distribution was quite different from what we have now. When the Soviet Union disintegrated, 40% of population were Kazakh, 40% of population were Russians, and 20% of minority. Today, the situation is quite different. Today, Kazakhs are about 70%, okay? About 10% of minorities and 20% of ethnic Russians and Slavs. Okay, so apparently when the Soviet Union disintegrated, it was very important to define the status of Kazakh and how to define it and show it that it's above all other languages. So it's the language planners came up with an idea that we're going to declare Kazakh national status. And then kind of no language has an official status, but nevertheless they use it for the official purposes. So Kazakh and Russian are used for official purposes, but also we don't have a status of minority languages. Kazakhstan and neither of any former Soviet states have signed the Charter of Minority Languages. So we don't use minority as a term internally. We use people of Kazakhstan, or we use the term diasporas. So this is about status. When it comes to about corpus, again, there's a massive and tons of work were done to develop Kazakh language to make it fit for the modern purposes, especially to be used as an official language, as a language of academia, language of business, and a lot of dictionaries are created, a new terminology is created, then codification is done, and so on and so on. What I'm not talking about today, but I'm sure you're very, very much aware of the ongoing debate on alphabet and orthography change. So, and the problem, we cannot set the orthography spelling because we still don't have the set alphabet, and it's kind of ongoing debate in the country which alphabet to choose. Almost in our national game now. Okay, so there's everyone, linguists and non-linguists, try to come up with their own version of alphabet and justify why one version is better than the other. So we're still in this limbo. We kind of said that we're shifting from Cyrillic to Latin, but because we don't have a definite approved final version of the alphabet itself, there is no approved final version of the spelling system. Okay? So it's very interesting what is happening in terms of linguistic landscape because of this uncertainty. And of course, also when it comes to language spread, a lot was done to make sure that population learns Kazakh, and Kazakh, if not becomes dominant language, but at least once becomes a very equal partner in everyday conversation. And one of the major ways to do that was education. From the very beginning, Kazakh became more Kazakh-speaking schools. Kazakh medium schools were opened because they're not like largely, were not very available at the beginning, and especially in urban areas like Almaty, for example, or Karaganda in the north. Most of the schools were in Russian. So the more Kazakh schools were opened, and Kazakh became a required subject in all Russian medium schools. And today, kids in schools have up to 5 hours of Kazakh every week, starting from grade 1 in Russian medium schools. And of course, some work was done on identity, creating a positive identity of Kazakh and Kazakh speakers, but this was to a lesser degree. So all major efforts in language planning were focused on status, on corpus, and language spread. So what happened since then? As I said, the demographic has changed, but also the school enrollment data has changed considerably. Today, up to 80% of school children are actually getting the education in Kazakh medium schools. Okay? So it's a significant shift. Also, what we have today is that the south and the west of the country are practically mono-ethnic, and Kazakh there is the main language of public domain. And also, I'd like to note, because it seems like a lot of people here in Kazakhstan are not aware that Kazakh is among the top 100 languages with most speakers. Okay, why do you want to say that? Because despite all these changes, demographic changes, changes in school enrollment, increasing in not just bilingual Kazakh speakers, but actually increasing number of monolingual Kazakh speakers, and the fact that Kazakh is among the most top spoken languages in the world, in Kazakhstan, alarmist discourse is very, very prevalent. So there are still people out there who constantly say that Kazakh language is in distress, that it's going to die, we need to do something, and that Kazakh language is in danger. So it's a very, very persistent discourse in our public domain. And by itself, it wouldn't be a problem, okay? Because there is some justification to it, because Kazakh still is not functioning, is not fully functioning as an official language. There's language development needs to be done in that area when it comes to terminology. Then there is a lot of code mixing and code switching on everyday talk, like when we talk in terms of purism and so on. Yes, there are issues that people could worry about. Nevertheless, what I find particularly worrisome is that this discourse of language endangerment actually coexists with other discourses, which I find are disruptive and dangerous. Okay, one is continuously shaming and blaming Russian speakers, and especially Russian-speaking ethnic Kazakhs, for not speaking Kazakh in all spheres, in all domains, and blaming them for the fact that language is not developing. Then from time to time, we hear calls to strip the Russian language of its status, even though it doesn't have any official status. What it says, I repeat, it can be used at par with Kazakh when necessary. So people say that this is too much, so Russians shouldn't have any status, shouldn't be mentioned in our constitution. Then there are also calls to close Russian medium schools. They are believed to be dangerous, especially after what is happening in Ukraine. Also, there's a lot of conversation is happening that we need to eliminate all our mixed schools. And so mixed school is not is something very specific. So mixed school, it doesn't mean that kids are educated bilingual school and kids are getting education in two languages. Mixed school, it simply means that in one building, you have some classes that are taught in Russian and some classes that are taught in Kazakh. So the kind of two schools are coexisting in one physical building. Why is it happening? Because, as I said previously, most of the schools in Kazakhstan used to be Russian, especially in urban areas, used to be Russian medium. And now when parents decide, more parents chose to educate their kids in Kazakh, and my internal migration happened, a lot of people from rural areas moved to larger cities like Almaty. There was a need to open more Kazakh medium schools and Kazakh medium classes, but there is no facilities available. So one of the solutions was to open Kazakh classes in Russian medium schools. So the half of the schools is Russian medium and another half is Kazakh medium. So, and there is a very, very frequently the calls that we have to eliminate these mixed schools, that the fact that Kazakh-speaking kids study with Russians and Russian speakers is actually endangering their language acquisition. It's bad for their identity, and so on and so on. Also, we hear frequent calls that we need to stop teaching Russian in Kazakh medium schools. And these calls became more active after the February events. So I'm just giving examples of various things you can hear in our media and public discourse. And one of the things I've heard when people are discussing alphabet, we're saying why only Kazakh learners should suffer and switch from Cyrillic to Roman script. Why don't we change writing for the Russian language as well? Okay. And I explained what happened. The whole discussion was people are saying, oh, if you do that, if you change the alphabet, parents would, people are striking. I actually heard that this was an official event where people were discussing alphabet. And one of the speakers said, well, you're all aware that if we finally change the alphabet, when we finally change the alphabet from Kazakh alphabet from Cyrillic to Roman, a lot of parents would decide against sending their kids to Kazakh medium schools and opt for Russian medium schools. So to prevent that, why don't we change the script for the Russian as well? So in both schools, kids suffer. Okay, not just Kazakh-speaking kids. Okay, so this is what we hear, and the alarmist discourse is very, very dominant in our public debate. So what is happening? So as I said, on one hand, we actually have the dramatic changes in demographic composition. On the other hand, we still see this distress that Kazakh is not doing enough, and the Kazakh speakers, there are not enough Kazakh speakers, and the Kazakh language is not well developed, is not functioning as it's supposed to function. The state officials don't speak the language, and so on and so on. Okay, so the question I'm asking is, what is happening? Why do we keep having this debate 30 years later? Okay, and a little bit of theory here. So what we have, and a lot of linguists, sociolinguists, and state officials, we kind of still operate in Bourdieu's model when we have this political structure of the nation state. Okay, and if you look at this traditional structure, the way it was developed in the Western literature, is this model assigns a particular language variety as a state language. Okay? So, for example, French in France, English in the UK, German in Germany, and in this particular linguistic market, if you speak the right choice of a language, so if you speak the state language, okay, state or official, okay, it is seen as indexical of being the right sort of a person and gives access to the right sort of education, okay, which in turn allows access to other economic and cultural resources. Okay, so if you speak standard French, then you become you have access to other things. Okay, you have access to better education, or like education gives you access to better French, then becomes intrinsically linked to your identity and to different types of access, different types of economic position, your status, and a variety of cultural resources. Okay, so this is the traditional established nation states. However, what we're seeing in Kazakhstan, this framework doesn't really capture the states in transition, states where we are reimagining our language hierarchy. Okay, so Russian used to be the dominant official and state language of the Soviet Union, and Kazakh, even though it had an official status as a titular language of the Republic, nevertheless, the hierarchy was quite clear. So you had Russian and then titular language and the minority languages. Okay, now the whole system is changing, and the Kazakh now, and actually when you do surveys among people, and we've been doing surveys, me and other colleagues, it's actually so that now in the new imagined hierarchy of languages, you have Kazakh, they have English, and Russian is slowly moving to the bottom of that hierarchy from the top. Okay, so we have this situation, which is very flux. Okay, so going back to the paradox. So what is happening? Kazakh is a state language, and it is a language of majority of population. Okay, yet what we're seeing a persistent social inequality which runs along language lines. So we have social inequality that coincides with language lines and ethnic lines. Okay, Kazakh speakers still tend to be less well educated, and they're much more likely to be socially disadvantaged in comparison with their Russian-speaking compatriots. Okay. And I explain what is happening. Russian proficiency is still linked to higher income, while a lack of language proficiency appears to act as an economic penalty. So if you are monolingual Kazakh speaker, it's more difficult for you to find a better job in urban areas, of course, and not all country, but central part of the country, north and east. And when we looked at international tests like PISA, we see that Kazakh medium schools underperform in almost all tests. Okay, and it's kind of easy explanation to say that's the language that at fault here. But if you look at actually what we're seeing is that we're seeing growing socioeconomic inequality between rural and urban population. Okay, and in Kazakhstan, like in many post-Soviet states, this division is extremely important. So it's not just a place of residence, because it's a serious class gap, because urban areas remain underdeveloped. There's, like, in comparison to rural areas remain underdeveloped. There is no jobs. And I'm going to mention that a little bit later, just flagging that it's such an important division. And it happened to be that during the Soviet time, most of Kazakhs lived outside of the city, okay, in underdeveloped region with little access to quality education. So of course, these divisions became even worse when the Soviet Union and help subsidiaries to the agricultural culture disappeared. Okay, and just to mention, in Almaty, for example, in the 1980s, only 20% of urban Almaty population were ethnic Kazakhs, 80% or Russian, Slavs, or other nationalities. Okay? And now the composition of the city, Almaty, the largest megapolis, is very different. Okay? Now the majority of population are actually ethnic Kazakhs, while the city still remains one of the most Russified. Also, so that was a kind of socioeconomic aspect of it. Now, when it comes to education policy, what we're seeing that from our data is that while Russian still mediates socioeconomic divisions, and as I said previously, like middle class and upper middle class and urbans are more likely to be Russian speakers, okay? If not monolingual, but very, very balanced bilinguals. In rural areas, actually, Russian access to Russian is very limited, okay? And because of lack of quality of Russian language teaching and decreasing ethnic diversity, okay, access to Russian is becoming limited. And I even claimed in one of the papers, I really like Blumer's term bourgeois resource. I think it is becoming that bourgeois resource. On the certain classes speak Russian, but it's not the standard Russian is no longer accessible to a lot of people in Kazakhstan. So they may speak vernacular Kazakh, they may have some passive ability to watch TV programs, but it's not full proficiency in Russian, professional proficiency to be able to do things in the language. Okay, and also I'm sure you are quite aware of the trilingual policy that we announced in 2015 and fully implemented in 2016. Okay, where people were told that all children in Kazakhstan should be developing proficiency in three languages: Kazakh, Russian, and English. And some subjects were supposed to be taught in English, some subjects were in Kazakh, and some subjects in Russian in both schools, Kazakh medium and Russian medium schools. But as Karabasova rightly noted, more emphasis was actually put on proficiency and developing proficiency in English than in Kazakh among Russian speakers or Russian among Kazakh speakers. Okay, and what I would say is that it's further deepened already existing inequality, and I use Myers-Scott term elite closure. So now what we see is that elite is actually multilingual. Okay, a lot of kids that come from elite schools or upper middle class families, they actually speak at least two. Most of them speak three languages. If you look in the rural area, if you look at the minority population, then they're more likely to speak non-standard varieties of Kazakh, non-standard variety of Russian, and have very little access or proficiency in English. Okay? So I'm using the term linguistic repertoire here instead of just talking about languages. Okay, so what I think we're seeing is that language policy has unintentionally resulted in a widening already existing social difference and social inequality, and it's important that it's globalizing the economy. So Kazakhstan, because we are fully integrated in the global system, no longer in a separate enclosed piece of land. Okay, so this resulted that in growing gap between different social groups who happen to speak, who happen to have different linguistic repertoires. Okay? So how this global market, new global market, is different. Okay, and there are a couple of quotes I think they're important for understanding what is happening here. And Heller, 2003, she said, we need to expand our understanding of language as a marker of ethnic identity or national affiliation to include consideration of how the position of a language within the global knowledge-based marketplace can affect how both the language and its speakers are socially positioned. Okay, so it's no longer we're talking about, as I said, enclosed Kazakhstan, when people speak Kazakh, Russian, and other minority languages. We're actually participating in a global market. Okay, the people are going to study abroad. We have international corporations. We're opening international schools. We're opening international universities. Our elite is actually very, very much linked to the international elite. The kids go to study in top universities. So, but that again, this is you see a very, very mobile elite and pretty immobile lower classes, especially in rural areas. Okay, so kind of, but it's important to understand. And also, I really like what Kodo said in 2018, that we need to reevaluate our current assumption that desires for independent territory and self-rule are more important for language revitalizations than economic advantage. And we need to admit that little attention paid to political economy produces naive accounts of the role of language in relations to promotion of social justice. So what I'm trying then further develop is that we need a lot more critical appraisal of language policy. So we should stop speaking just about developing language, and then Kazakh people would say, we need to make our Kazakh stronger, because if you don't develop, because language it's an ideology, like language is something that exists in your heads. It's not an objective reality. Language is a sum of its speakers. So for the language to develop, you need to develop its speakers. Okay? Something that is obvious to sociolinguists still kind of eludes many people when they talk about languages and language policy. So what I'm trying to say is that we need a very critical appraisal of both sociolinguistic and socioeconomic consequences of language reforms, because what you meant to be to help to develop Kazakh actually created a wider socioeconomic differences and gaps between people who have different linguistic repertoires. And also we need to ask ourselves, what was the effect of raising the status of Kazakh, upscaling Kazakh in the context of expansion of existing political economies and globalization? And what we've seen is actually, as I said, if you are a monolingual Kazakh speaker, who recently internally migrated from rural area to urban area, you have no education, you have no other languages, and you have like no means to buying a house, you have no job, no skills. Of course, and nothing else that, but then you're told you are the titular, you're a representative of titular nationality, and you have more rights than anyone else. Okay, so this is not the healthiest of situations you may want to have in your country. Okay, so what is important, I think, and this is especially important for our state officials to understand, okay, something we already know in sociolinguistics, but it still kind of eludes many officials when they talk about language policy, is that recognition does not lead to fair redistribution. Even if you change the status of languages, but it doesn't have an economic mechanism to it, then we just gonna see a widening socioeconomic gaps. So for so long, the state policy has been focusing on discursive strategies of legitimization of the Kazakh nation state. Okay? And the key form of traditionalist knowledge production were reclaiming physical and symbolic spaces. We did a lot of renaming of our linguistic landscape, managing population, homogenization and redistribution. We had a policy of bringing ethnic Kazakhs from abroad. Today, almost 2 million of our population out of about 20 million, 10%, are actually what we call Oralman, and now new term Kandas, the people who Kazakhs who are born outside of Kazakhstan and repatriated, and the distribution of population from the Kazakh dominant south to the Russian dominant north, and managing language. Okay. So that's what we did traditionally, and we did it by the book. Okay, so we did everything that literature says we're supposed to do for this traditionalist knowledge and a new reality production. However, at the same time, little or no attention was paid to eliminating structural and material inequalities, and this is you have to understand. This is like we're talking about the situation when the Soviet Union continuously integrated, it's actually meant abolishing the whole support system for rural industry and subsidiaries. Okay, and subsidies, and it resulted in unemployment, growing poverty, declining standards of living. So a lot of auls in rural Kazakhstan, they don't have access to water or heating, even though we are oil producing nation. Okay, a lot of small schools were closed because they're too expensive to maintain, and we have huge territory with small population. So that was deemed to be too expensive, and a lot of small schools were closed. So it led to urbanization and abandoning small cities, abandoning auls, just name it. And in general, it's also meant decline in quality of education because of immigration. A lot of teachers, especially of non-Kazakh ethnic background, left the country. And you probably know that about 1 million of Germans left the country, a lot of Ukrainians left the country, a lot of Russians left the country, and up until recently, up until war, okay, more people are leaving than coming back of certain ethnic groups. And all this led to mass rural to urban migration, long commuting for work in cities, and many migrants who are mainly Kazakh speaking remain marginalized in these urban areas. So what are the lessons we need to take from our case? Okay? So I believe that Kazakhstan's case illustrates that without the guarantee of material conditions for actual participation, recognition alone simply gives a symbolic voice to subaltern bodies. Okay? So by itself, having a voice is not so bad, just even having a voice if you have nothing, had nothing previously. But I think what is dangerous is that that giving symbolic voice without changing socioeconomic positioning of speakers can be potentially dangerous. And we've already seen this conflict when Kurdai conflict with Kazakhs, basically pogrom of Dungan communities by ethnic Kazakhs. And we constantly see these clashes from for Kazakh speakers and other ethnic groups. So what I'm calling for is that we should stop treating symptoms, because language is just a symptom. Okay, of course it's very important. Of course it's very symbolic, but we've done enough in terms of symbolic redistribution. Now we need to think of more material sources for inequality. So we need to eliminate this material source of inequality. Okay, by focusing predominantly on discourse production and language management, language policy research de-emphasizes the material sources of inequality. So we don't talk enough about divisions between rural and urban Kazakhstan. So we focus on languages while we should be speaking about socioeconomic differences. What in turn is that language management often restricted by the ritualistic and symbolic gestures, and it cannot change and rectify historically formed relations of power, okay? Because they remain, so we keep talking about language, that we're not doing enough, that we have to create another dictionary, maybe no one is using, or we're changing street names, but we're doing very little to change the actual conditions that create these tensions and inequality. And my recommendation would be that in Kazakhstan and in other situations, similar situations, language policy recommendations must address the need to create economic niches and opportunities for speakers of languages and process of revitalization and reinstatement. And this is well known in literature. So for language to revitalize languages, its speakers should have economic niches. Okay, but if you just simply change the status without giving them this economic opportunity, without creating the spaces where language can be safely used and can develop, and but you need to create domains where particular language is required. Okay, so we know that from the literature already, from the context of language revitalization of small languages, and I think we should use that even when we talk about languages as Kazakh, which is a state language. But a lot of people who speak Kazakh, they don't have economic and educational opportunities. So we need to create that to change the situation. So instead of just speaking about language, we should speak about changing and challenging material source of inequality. So this is basically it. I am done. Okay, and I'm ready for your questions.